Somewhere, right now, a water treatment facility is running software from the 1990s. The vendor that built it went out of business 2 decades ago. There's no patch, there's no fix, and it is connected to your network. It's not hypothetical. It's the reality of critical infrastructure today, and it gets more unsettling from there. In this episode, we'll go deep into the world of operational technology security, medical device networks, and the systems that keep our hospitals running, our water clean, and our power on. These are not abstract targets. They're actively attacked, and in some cases, the attackers are winning. Our guest has been on the front lines of defending exactly these types of environments. He walks us through documented attacks on Polish critical infrastructure. That means water facilities, hospitals, and electrical grids, where intrusions weren't pulled off with sophisticated zero-day exploits. They used default passwords. That's it. Default passwords on internet-facing routers. But just as we start to think the problem is simple to solve, AI is changing the calculus for attackers in a fundamental way. You no longer need to be a water treatment expert to sabotage a water treatment plant. You just need a screenshot and a large language learning model. We also get into a problem that almost nobody is talking about yet. What happens when your AI coding agent starts acting as you, with your credentials, with your access, with your audit trail? Can anyone tell the difference? Basically, all this comes down to good hygiene. You can lock down your systems today the way we know how to lock them down. Then you're already ahead of the game right there. Then when the new stuff comes in, you stop it because you've already locked down everything else. This is a story that will make you rethink what security fundamentals actually mean in 2026, and why getting back to basics might be the most radical thing you can do. I'm Robert Vamosi. This is Error Code.
I am Piotr Kupisiewicz. I'm a CTO at Elisity. Elisity is a company that provides microsegmentation solutions.
Before we get started, I'd like to clarify, what are these microsegmentations? Are they in the network, in the cloud? How is Peter defining them?
So at Elisity, we are basically focusing on protecting the OT and IOMT, so medical infrastructure, as well as the OT, the classical OT infrastructure, and we are entering more and more the critical infrastructure part. And this is where we are providing microsegmentation. We are basically trying to protect the devices which normally people are unable to patch because they are legacy system, old systems. The patching of this infrastructure is very difficult or sometimes even impossible. So we are basically focusing on limiting the blast radius versus traditional the traditional way the problem is being solved, which is usually patching and vulnerability management.
Let's talk a little bit about the threat landscape. This is certainly changing now that Anthropic has Mythos and OpenAI has Opus. They're capable of pattern matching, finding vulnerabilities long before the humans do. And this is going to create an influx of new vulnerabilities. How's that going to impact critical infrastructure?
So the paradigm shift that we are seeing because of Anthropic Mythos and basically the AI entering the cyber landscape is basically that in the past, we as the defenders, we were focusing on identifying the vulnerable systems, especially in the critical infrastructure, as well as OT, as well as in IOMT. And we were trying basically to patch the systems that we knew are vulnerable. And this, there were certain priorities that we were attaching to different systems. So basically, when there was a critical vulnerability and we knew that it existed, for instance, there's a part of our critical infrastructure that has a critical vulnerability, we were focusing on addressing, this system first, and we were basically trying to patch and secure all vulnerable systems. I think the paradigm has shifted now because frankly speaking, everyone is assuming that all systems are vulnerable, right? And
Right.
even though you might not know about the open, vulnerability, people and folks in security just assume that all systems are vulnerable, right? So I think it changed, the landscape and the way especially the vulnerabilities are being approached.
A lot of these systems were put in place because they thought the devices were unreachable. Clearly, they are reachable today with all the interconnectivity that we have. What sort of mitigations, then, can exist if these devices were built without security, without any sort of plan for that future?
In my opinion, I think we still should not forget about the security foundations. If the system does not require the external network connectivity, it should not have such. I think these are the basics. And what we have seen here in Poland in some of the publicly documented attacks on our critical infrastructure, they were basically using very basic misconfigurations. So I think how I should call them. We are talking basically about routers and firewalls which had an external access enabled with default passwords. This is not a rocket science. It's just very, very basic. Yeah, I mean, just the basic, it's not even a vulnerability, it's just misconfiguration. But when we are talking about the small critical infrastructure facilities, very often you will have a single IT person or security person supporting tens of or dozens of these. So I think, just going back to the basics, just making sure that when the infrastructure does not require the network connectivity, just make sure that the points of contacts, like the jump hosts, the firewalls, they are just basically configured properly. And I think this is a great starting point. Now going further, as you mentioned, sometimes it's impossible. Sometimes some of these devices do require the external network connectivity or some internal network connectivity. And we need to think about, and in these scenarios, I think, again, going back to the basics, just try to avoid having a flat infrastructure, flat network within the infrastructure. It's very rare that everything needs to talk to everything else. I love this analogy of a ships, like or submarines, where we have this, where we are basically segmenting or building these containment zones, right? When there is a leak or flood, the whole ship doesn't go down. It's just a part of the ship that is being impacted. And I think if we think similarly, and we all know, and you know very well, Robert, that the segmentation or firewalls are very old topic. Firewalls are around for the last 30 years. And I think we should not forget about these very simple solutions of just segmenting properly the network. The batch readers should not be able to communicate with the most critical parts of the infrastructure. It's again, these are basics, and it might sound very naive and obvious, but our experience here at Elisity shows that even though we are talking about basics, majority of the enterprises, as well as majority of the OT IoT systems, not mentioning the critical infrastructure, are still not having these basics covered, right? And I think this is a great starting point.
So with regard to these devices being out in the field for 20, 30 years, not designed to have any security, Peter is saying that having microsegmentation as a network layer above them is like having a security control that should protect them.
Yes, it's basically compensating control. It does not address the actual root cause of systems being vulnerable. We are all seeing, the systems that are 30 years old running, Windows 95, not patched for 30 years. And frankly speaking, there's no one that can actually patch the device or the system because it has some low-level drivers that are supporting very complex machine. The vendor is out of business for the last 20 years. There's nobody who can patch it. And just the best way to approach it, in my humble view, is just to build a compensating control around that system, and ideally having a segment of one, so this potentially vulnerable system cannot talk to anything else in the infrastructure, and we are just limiting what can be done to the device as well as from the device, right?
Peter also alluded to some events that have happened in Poland.
Yes, I mean, it's, again, publicly documented. We are talking about publicly documented events. There's nothing confidential that I'm disclosing here, but basically our government has shared some of the security incidents that occurred in the last couple of years. As your audience might know, Poland is the eastern flank of NATO here in Europe. We are actually in continuous hybrid war with Russia. Our infrastructure, critical infrastructure, as well as our companies are being constantly attacked. We are actually the most attacked country in Europe in terms of the NATO. So what has been disclosed is, again, very probably it was a Russian state actor trying or actually successfully entering our critical infrastructure. We are talking here about water purification objects or facilities. And again, the attack vectors, there are a couple of attacks really well described. There's even a video showing, how attacker has entered the facility. By entered, I mean digitally, right, remotely. And we are again talking here about just the basic hygiene that was not really followed, right? We are talking about default passwords on the routers with an external access, and again, it's very cheap to just scan as a threat, as an attacker, right? Just to scan the public internet for the routers with the default password. So again, no rocket science, and and our government has published really detailed documents on how these attacks unfolded, and the reason basically for that is just to all the companies, to all the folks who are administering the critical infrastructure, is just again follow the basics, right? And I think, Robert, also what we are seeing, I'm curious if you are seeing it as well, but what we are seeing at Elisity as well as here in Poland, we are seeing a lot of attention in cybersecurity being focused on very complex, I don't want to say AI hyped, but some of the solutions are very complex. Like we are talking about SOC being powered by AI, and some very complex pattern recognition driven by AI. I don't want to say that these are not good solutions, but at the same time, what we are seeing is that the companies are spending their budgets on these very complex solutions, not having, again, the basics covered, just
Right.
the basic identity management, the basic segmentation, not having the default username and password on your external routers. These are the basics that we see not being covered, while at the same time, very sophisticated AI-driven solutions are being impacted. So I think there's a balance that we need to find here, and just not forget about the basics.
So when we're talking about water utilities, did it actually reach down to the PLCs, or was it at the HMI level, where the gauges were giving false readings, but they were actually functioning as they should?
No, so they actually succeeded in terms of the the instrumentation of the water purification facility. So they could actually change the settings of the infrastructure there, and I think this is yet another kind of yet another angle that we need to be aware of, right? Like in the past, it was, even if an attacker took control over like a PLC or the different system that manages the like, for instance, the water purification station, it still requires certain knowledge to actually even do something harmful, right? Meaning, you needed to know what to do actually to potentially, impact negatively the operations, the day-to-day operations of the facility. But nowadays, with like ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, the LLMs, basic, you can just paste the print screen of a system, and it will probably guide you quite well in terms of what to do, right? And it just lowered the bar for the attackers, right? Because you don't need to be now a water purification expert, and still you can potentially damage the operations. Here in Poland, fortunately, there were physical hardware level limits, so the attackers were not successful. They didn't permanently damage the system, but they were trying. Yeah, and this is even seen on some of the videos that were.
So that's water. There are also attacks on the electrical grid as well.
Yes, electrical grids, hospitals. Actually, there's unfortunately plenty of these. Some of them, the electrical grid attacks. I'm a little less. I have less information in terms of what exactly happened. It's because not everything is really well described by the government mainly for the security reasons, obviously, right? But yes, hospitals. We actually had here in the southern part of Poland one of the hospitals being down for actually 72 hours because of the attack, right? And actually there were human lives seriously impacted by what happened there. Yeah, so unfortunately it happens.
So I find hospitals are an interesting problem. Most people think of them as being very complex, and often they are. But, are the surgical theaters separate from the pharmacy, from the food service, or whatever? In other words, is there segmentation going on? I've asked this question to a number of experts. So I'm wondering, has Peter found that hospitals in general are flat, or have they been segmented?
I mean, so again, there are, especially in the United States, there are different hospital systems managed by different companies, right? So they have various levels of security that we are seeing. I think, the starting point, I've seen different studies on this, and we have also seen here at Elisity, we are working with quite a few hospital systems. The interesting fact that I didn't know, frankly speaking, before I started to work with these large hospital systems, is that it depends on the hospital, depends on obviously on the different verticals within the hospitals, but we are seeing between 16 and 30 sensors connected, basically, supporting a single bed, right? And if you think about it, 16 to 30, systems, all of them having IP addresses, majority of them not being really patched because it's physically impossible. It is a threat vector that we cannot ignore. What we are seeing, Robert, is it's very interesting. Again, this is my experience, and statistically, I have only a relatively small sample. But what we are seeing is that usually the hospitals are segmented, but I would call it macro segmented. So different buildings will have a firewall in between. The IT from an IOMT will have firewall in between. But when we are talking again about, for instance, children study, being separated from a different part of the operationally from different part of the hospital, this does not necessarily happens. And we also see I would say interesting way of segmenting the devices, where we have seen hospitals, but we have also seen it in OT, where the classical manufacturing, for instance, where the segmentation is being done, for instance, by the device type. So you will have all the PLCs across multiple manufacturing lines in a single segment. And fundamentally, we think it's wrong. Meaning, we should rather try to segment by the role. Like, for instance, manufacturing line number 1 should not talk to line number 2, but it shouldn't be that PLCs in line number 1 are able to talk to line number 2, because operationally this is not a requirement. And the blast radius is just, it's just a wrong, not really optimal way of segmenting from a security perspective, right? So basically, what I'm trying to say is that we are seeing quite a few hospitals which are having some kind of segmentation, but very often, Robert, it's very difficult to actually assess what's my blast radius today, what should I do to improve it. And we actually spent the last couple of years here at Elisity building tools where we are actually showing, like, hey, Robert, if you are going to create this one particular segment, your blast radius is going to decrease by 20%. So this is the next step operationally that you should follow, and you have this one score which you are trying to reduce, which is a blast radius. So it's almost it is an art, but there's a science to it, the segmentation itself.
And again, I'd like to return to this concept of microsegmentation. Peter just said that role-based segmentation is a better way to go. And I've often thought of that as devices, but not role-based. I guess that makes a lot of sense. So how would you go into, say, a hospital and determine all the different roles that might be, given that each hospital is different?
I mean, so I think the end goal is basically to minimize what should talk to what in the network, which device should be able to communicate to which device to minimum, meaning if there are two devices that should never communicate with each other and they don't actually, it's frankly speaking the easiest starting point, right? This is actually how we are starting the microsegmentation projects. We are entering the network, we are looking at the flows from a net flow perspective, and we are seeing that this device in this building never talks to this set of devices in that building. And this is really the great starting point, just things that do not talk to each other and should not talk to each other, you just plug them. And then if there's an attack and vulnerability being exploited, in one of these segments, you are already protected. This is frankly speaking the first step, right? And then what we are seeing is basically the segments which are based on like again, the hospital. I mean, it's always the easiest at this to me to explain it based on the manufacturing, right? Like it's easy for people to visualize it. When we are having a single manufacturing line, very often it should never talk to the second manufacturing line. And the roles of the devices. So for instance, segmenting within the manufacturing line one, it's great to have. But what we are seeing is it's basically there are limited resources that we have as the cybersecurity teams, right? And we should strive to invest our resources, our time first in the activities that are increasing our security levels the most. And again, what we are seeing is that the great starting point in manufacturing is, for instance, just separating line one from line two, from line three, line four. In hospital, it will be having a single, again, children study should never, the devices there should never communicate with a different area of the hospital, because it's not necessarily needed, right? And then once you achieve this goal of having this, maybe like I would say medium segments, then you can go to kind of micro segmentation itself. So for instance, segmenting within the one particular faculty, etc., if it makes sense. This is our approach.
So we talked a little bit about AI, and I'd like to get more into that. So there is expected to be a flood of new undisclosed vulnerabilities in the next year. I call it a flood of 0 days. And this is the result of AI work that's being done right now. So how should organizations be thinking about this in terms of critical infrastructure protection?
I mean, first of all, I would say that I think all of us are still struggling in how to approach it. And, I don't want to sound as I have all the answers. I have, again, obviously I will be a little biased because, my day is just filled with microsegmentation or segmentation in general. And what we are seeing, and what I'm seeing is that, the segmentation has actually so many advantages, right? You don't need security operations center to build segments. They are kind of passive way of protecting your infrastructure, right? You set up the segmentation, and obviously there's a monitoring part to it, but the segmentation is there. It's already limiting the blast radius, just working there for you once you configured it once. So again, my approach, especially when we are talking about OT, IOMT, and critical infrastructure, is just to try to contain the risk, right? Just build this, containment zones and limit the blast radius. I think that the story is completely different when we are talking about the devices that you can actually patch. I mean, this will not address the 0 days, right? But at least day one, once the vulnerabilities are being exposed, our recommendation should always be to patch and address the issues, right? But again, what we are seeing, and I kind of agree with this approach, is just assume that every device out there has a vulnerability, and just try to to limit the blast radius, right? And if there is a, and sorry, just doing maybe a step back, right? I think identifying the resources and the pieces of infrastructure that has the most critical data from a confidentiality perspective or operational continuity perspective is the key, and making sure that there's, frankly speaking, almost nothing that can talk to your primary file server, where you, for instance, have all the R&D or or whatever other device is really critical to the business. I think identifying these and just almost completely isolating them. So going back to the basics of firewalls from '97, is the approach I would recommend.
AIs are capable of looking at really old protocols and finding vulnerabilities. So let's just say that it finds something in Modbus. Modbus is everywhere. So how would microsegmentation protect a situation where it's a protocol that's a commodity used across multiple devices and therefore multiple different roles that you're protecting?
Protocols like Modbus or even other layer 2 protocols, that are not necessarily even requiring an IP address, still can be segmented, right? And I mean, first of all, identifying which devices are talking Modbus and should they really talk Modbus, I think it's a great starting point, right? Because for instance, just a regular PC of an employee in the hospital should not necessarily talk Modbus. And even having this, detection and protection, meaning, if we see a PC that should never talk Modbus and suddenly it starts to talk Modbus, and putting in the quarantine or even disconnecting it from the network, for security operations center to react, it's a great starting point. And then, still, with the Modbus, it is possible to, not all the devices need to be on the, be able to talk Modbus to each other. We still can, try to separate which devices can talk from Modbus on any other protocol, layer 2 or layer 3. It's still the same paradigm that we are seeing. So actually, we do have a couple of installations where, we are looking into Modbus as the protocol, and we are still trying to to segment them as much as possible.
So it sounds like Peter's going back to this idea that configuration is important and that having least privilege is the most important thing here. Why have it broadcast everything when it should be limited to only a few things?
You mentioned about the least privilege, even though we at Elisity are not doing least privilege, but now just talking from my personal perspective, especially we are talking about AI being used offensively. What we are seeing being a threat, and it's kind of almost a self-inflicted risk, is that a lot of companies, a lot of employees, especially for us in IT, are using the AI agents, like coding AI agents, etc. And kind of an obvious gap that we are seeing, that I'm seeing, is the kind of a pseudo concept, meaning, the elevation of privileges. So what I'm trying to say is that if, for instance, I'm using today Cloud Code, I will probably use it, on my laptop, where I'm a kind of a privileged or escalated. I mean, I'm basically an administrator in multiple systems out there. And then when Cloud Code is operating on my laptop, it's basically acting as me, as Piotr, right? And I think there's yet to, I mean, the industry is still yet to build the solutions which are actually addressing this issue. So, when my Cloud Code or Codex or ChatGPT or any other AI-based system is operating as me, I think it should use, again, least privilege, just having an identity attached to what the particular agent should do,
Right.
and nothing else. I think it's again a risk that I'm seeing, that we are seeing, and frankly speaking, there are no good solutions yet, because still the identity platforms, Active Directory or any others, are still mainly built for humans. And
Yes.
there's one Robert out there, while in reality, I think you should have 20 Roberts with different, privileges to the system, to the infrastructure, etc., being used correctly by the agents out there. So not necessarily connected with segmentation that we've talked about, but I thought it's maybe worth sharing. It's a risk and threat that I see and in quite a few places.
Peter brings up a good point. One could now have multiple AI agents acting as you, acting on your behalf. And that creates a weird distinction. In the identity space, it's like a human being has an identity, yes, but now we have these machine identities that need to be differentiated from the human identity, and yet associated back to that human identity. How's this going to work?
Again, if there's an agent using just my identity in the systems out there, that are being used by the agent, everywhere you will see my username doing something. And even from a security perspective, it really matters if it was Piotr, the human, or the agent running on my laptop, right? The audit log today very often is lacking this context that this was not an actual human, this was a machine doing certain action. And the consequences to the audit log, to the security operations centers out there are massive, depending on who is using it. So I do believe there is and there are quite a few startups that are working on solving this problem, and I do believe this is an important one. And similarly, from we here at Elisity, we are thinking how to then incorporate it into the broader segmentation concept, right? Because when for instance you, Robert, you are using the system, even from a network perspective, you probably should have different permissions. I'm talking about the connectivity perspective, about the network layer, than an agent, which maybe does not need to talk to this, critical infrastructure devices out there. So how to, distinguish who is actually, logged on the computer, or there might be multiple simultaneous users logged in, how to distinguish, at the packet level, who generated the specific traffic and then apply different policies. We are yet to figure it out, but I do believe that, again, I don't think we are ready. Would you agree on the machine kind of, level identity as well as the policy enforcements, etc.?
So I totally agree on that. Certainly being in a SOC in the moment and trying to determine, is this a real person doing this malicious activity, or is it an AI agent doing it? That is a problem. And I see down the road, we're coming in and having forensic responsibility of determining that these agents were conducting these things on your behalf and not an actual human being on the other side.
Yeah, there are so many. I think in general, the AI transformation and this whole technology is so exciting for us. I'm actually, I'm saying to our friends here at Elisity that I'm so grateful that, it happened during my lifetime, because there's just so much opportunity out there. I'm talking about, about defensive cybersecurity, and I mean the applicability of it is just, and you are able to iterate quicker in terms of software development, etc. But at the same time, there's just this whole plethora there's this whole area of opportunities and challenges that we are having, right? That we are yet to to address. So
I'd like to thank Peter for coming on the show and talking about microsegmentation and how it might be a solution to some of these devices that have been out in the field for 20, 30 years and lack the tools necessary to protect them. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I've got some great episodes coming up. We'll have more on Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and hacking utilities supply chains. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.